Christian nationalism, as we define it in our project, is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. Or put another way, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a quote unquote real American, that one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are often in line with conservative political priorities. Now, just to hold fundamentalist religious beliefs or just to have conservative political priorities does not necessarily mean that one is embracing Christian nationalism. But to hold the belief that to be a real American, one has to also hold those beliefs or fall into that narrow conception of what it means to be both Christian and American. That suggests that the ideology of Christian nationalism might be present. Now, I want to also talk about white Christian nationalism. And often, whenever I say Christian nationalism in the US context, you can also just substitute it for white Christian nationalism. And that's because you cannot understand Christian nationalism in the United States without also grappling with white supremacy and racial subjugation. And that's because Christian nationalism both creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that's limited to the very narrow group of people who held full rights of citizenship at the founding of the country. That was white, Protestant, Christian men who owned property. Those were the people who were fully included in the American project at the beginning, and everyone else was in some other tier of citizenship. Christian nationalism tells the story that that's the way that God created it, that that's the way that God intended it, and that really those are the people who are most deserving of rights continuing down to today. The Christian in white Christian nationalism, then, is less about a given religion or set of theological beliefs, but rather about an ethno-national identity of whiteness in the US context. And we can look to American history for prior iterations of white Christian nationalism, prior examples of it. One of the most prominent being the KKK. You know, the KKK now considered, thankfully, a fringe movement. But 100 years ago in the United States, it was a mainstream organization with millions of Americans belonging to the KKK. And that is an example of this toxic mix of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and violence. So Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, is a very old problem in the US context. It is not something new. Some of the markers of Christian nationalism. One is a very heavy reliance on this mythological history of the United States as a quote unquote Christian nation. Not in a demographic sense, but rather in a sense that America was founded by Christians in order to Christianity in law and policy. It cherry picks American history in order to tell this story. It often also emphasizes God's providential hand in American history and in present politics. And in that way, it's very much an exaggerated form of American exceptionalism. Now, there are many problems with this America as a Christian nation story. One is it is not an accurate portrayal of American history. As we know, as we heard from the First Amendment that was read earlier, the founders of the United States made a very deliberate choice at the founding period to disestablish religion from government control. They did so in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, but they also started that project in the original US Constitution itself. In the original text of the US Constitution, there is no mention of God. There is no mention of Christianity. There is no mention of Jesus. And in fact, the only reference to religion at all is Article 6 of the US Constitution, which prohibits religious tests for public office. And so to rebut this history, this mythological history of the United States as a Christian nation, my favorite argument is actually not to match anecdote for anecdote or quote for quote, although we can do that, but rather just go to the constitutional text itself. If indeed the founders were trying to set up a Christian nation, they did so in the most ineffective way possible by barring religious tests for public office from the very beginning. And that was not just an accident of history. That was a deliberate choice that they made. Many of the colonies at the time did have religious tests for public office, but the founders of the country wanted to do something different. And they made that choice not out of hostility to religion, but rather out of respect for religion and religious pluralism and religious diversity, recognizing that there were many faiths and many different expressions of Christianity that were present in the United States at its founding, and wanting to set up a constitutional order that would protect religious freedom by keeping it out of government control. And that government can both promote it and denigrate it, but both of those harm religion itself as well as harm religious pluralism. But this story of America as a Christian nation also has theological problems from a Christian perspective. The Gospel of John says, "For God so loved the world." It doesn't say, "For God so loved the United States." But that's the story that Christian nationalism tends to tell. It tends to suggest that God does love the United States best of all, that God does have a special plan for the United States, that God blesses America and everything that happens in the United States. And this story is very difficult to reconcile with Christianity as a global religion, Christianity as a religion that says that God's love knows no national borders. And so I think this is an important mythology for not just every American, but also every Christian to reckon with and to try to dismantle. Now, in understanding Christian nationalism, I think it's also helpful to understand what it's not. And so I want to talk about the difference between Christian nationalism and Christianity. Christian nationalism is a form of idolatry, and that's because it tends to merge political and religious identities into one. One of Jesus's teachings in the Gospel of Matthew was when some people came to Jesus trying to trap him. They asked him the question, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" Turns out paying taxes was about as popular then as it is now. And Jesus, instead of answering the question for them, made them answer it. He said, "Does anyone here have a coin?" And someone brought him a denarius coin. And he said, "Whose head is on that coin?" And they said, "Caesar's." And he answered, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Jesus was explaining that God is not Caesar and Caesar is not God. We do live in different national identities. We owe duties of citizenship to the country, but those are different and distinct from allegiances that we hold to God. They are not one and the same thing. Christian nationalism is also all about power, earthly power. And in that way, it is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus was always on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized by power. As Christians, we just celebrated the resurrection on Easter Sunday, which shows that earthly power is no match for God's power through love. But it's a very different conception of power than earthly power. And Jesus taught that by saying the first shall be last and the last shall be first, really trying to disrupt earthly power and doing it through love and through love of neighbor. And so this bears no resemblance to the teachings of Christian nationalism, which are all about power and which use Jesus, and often a white Jesus, as a mascot for power, but it doesn't at all bear any resemblance to the actual teachings of Jesus. But Christian nationalism does use the language and the symbols of Christianity And so to a casual observer, it can look a lot like the same thing. And so for those of us who are Christians, it is so important for us to tell the difference between following Jesus and following the teachings of Jesus and what it might show up and look like in our cultural context. And part of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign is really to speak directly to Christians and urge us to do some very self-reflective work on how has our religion been co-opted by power for centuries in ways that have distorted the teachings of Jesus and that we have, as American Christians, inherited through the centuries. And so I just want to give kind of a very brief tour of history to show some different places where Christians throughout the world took the gospel of love and sacrificed it on the altar to power, and how that has corrupted American Christianity in different ways throughout the centuries. We can go all the way back to Europe before the founding of the country, and when the doctrine of discovery was used to try to legitimate foreign conquest of the land that would become the United States. The doctrine of discovery is that deadly heresy that it was God's will for European conquerors to steal land and murder the native inhabitants of North and South America. But we also saw Christians, once they were on this land, use Christian theology and abuse Christian theology to try to legitimate slavery. And one example of that comes from the colony of Virginia and the year 1667. That is when the Assembly of Virginia, the colony of Virginia, which was composed entirely of white Anglican men. The colony of Virginia was a Christian nationalist colony in that it thoroughly merged religious and national identities into one. And that assembly passed a law that said that baptism would not free an enslaved Native American person of African descent or mixed race background. They took their theology of love and the saving power of baptism and sacrificed it on the altar to power to try to actually legalize and legitimate slavery. I'll turn to my own tradition. I am a Baptist from the South, and many white Baptists from the South trace our religious lineage through the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention was formed in 1845. It was formed as a breakoff from the Northern Baptists over the issue of slavery. The Southern Baptist Convention in 1845 claimed that slavery was, quote, an institution of heaven. And in 1863, the Southern Baptist Convention pledged to support the Confederacy in the Civil War. The same false gospel was used later to justify Jim Crow segregation and lynching, with church members, often members of the KKK as well. So when we think about Christian nationalism and its relation to Christianity, we have to realize just how old and pervasive this problem really is. Now, in understanding Christian nationalism, I also want to distinguish Christian nationalism from patriotism. And I'm going to use definitions here again. Patriotism as a love of country, and a love of country that can be expressed in a number of ways. Like any other kind of love, it can't be forced. It has to be freely chosen. And we can express our patriotism through symbolic ways, like waving an American flag or saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and in more expressive ways, like exercising our First Amendment rights, including our rights of protest. For many of us, we love our country enough to want better for it. And because of that, we are called often to criticize our government and where it's falling short of the founding promises of the U.S. Constitution. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all other allegiances, including those for those of us who are Christians, including to Jesus. So I think a helpful question to ask ourselves is our patriotism causing us to sacrifice or to denigrate or to ignore our religious convictions. If it is, then I would venture it is no longer a healthy love of country or patriotism, and instead it has drifted into these unhealthy and indeed dangerous waters of nationalism. But as we take on Christian nationalism, I think it's important to know that we don't have to give up our sense of patriotism in doing so. In fact, it is because of my sense of patriotism that I have dedicated so much of my professional life to taking on Christian nationalism. It's a false choice to say that one has to choose taking on Christian nationalism or patriotism. I think they actually go together quite well. So I want to talk briefly about just how prevalent of a problem is Christian nationalism. And I'm going to draw here from some national polling that has been done by PRRI, which stands for the Public Religion Research Institute. There has also been other excellent social service surveys done by academics Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. Many of these surveys use a similar methodology, but the statements I'm showing you here are the ones that are currently being used by PRRI. They ask respondents to answer 5 questions, or rather to say how much do they agree with these 5 statements. That the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American, and God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Now, you'll notice that these statements are really correlates to those markers of Christian nationalism that I pointed out previously. So then they ask people to respond to those statements. And if they strongly agree with all of those statements, then they are labeled as adherents to Christian nationalism. And you can see on this little graph that from these are the results that were just released in February of this year, that 10% of the survey respondents were marked as adherents to Christian nationalism. If they agree with all those statements, and maybe 1 or 2 they also strongly agree with, then they're labeled as sympathizers to Christian nationalism. If they strongly disagree with all of them, then they're labeled as rejectors of Christian nationalism. And if they disagree, but maybe not quite as strongly, then they're labeled as skeptics. Now, a few things to point out. One, Christian nationalism is measured on a continuum. These surveys measure a given point in time about how much are people moving towards or away from Christian nationalism. It is not a diagnosis. It's not something that you either have or you don't have. It's also not an immutable characteristic. It's something that can change. People's opinions can change. And so I point this out because I think often we use a shorthand of trying to label someone as a Christian nationalist. I don't think that that's a particularly accurate or helpful label to use for a person. I prefer saying that a person or a group is embracing Christian nationalism or rejecting Christian nationalism or skeptical of it or sympathetic to it, but that it's not actually a characteristic that they hold. Another thing to point out is if you take the sympathizers and adherents together, those are people who are moving towards Christian nationalism. That's 30%, which on the one hand is a large segment of the population. On the other hand is a distinct minority of the population, right? Nearly 2 to 1. We have more people who are rejecting or skeptical of it than people who are sympathizing or adhering to it. That is good news. There's not a lot of good news in this presentation, but that is good news that it really is a minority of the population. But as we'll see in a moment, we're seeing all of these unjust and discriminatory policies show up because that minority of people are holding a disproportionate amount of power, both nationally, but also regionally. And I think Florida is actually, like my home state of Texas, is an excellent example of a place where a small minority are holding much of the power and enforcing their views on everyone else. Now, the next few slides, you may have a hard time seeing the details here. If you want to go deep on this, you can go to prri.org and you can look at all of these numbers more in depth. But I'm hoping you can see at least the colors and you can see some of the trends on this. So that very top graph there, that just shows all Americans at the very top. And again, you've got 30% moving towards, about twice as many moving away. The first top shows basically that the more education you have, the less likely you are to embrace Christian nationalism. The next set of bars there show that for the most part, the younger you are, the less likely you are to embrace Christian nationalism. With one caveat, you'll see on the 18 to 29, they are actually slightly more likely to embrace Christian nationalism than the age group above them, 30 to 49. And just kind of note that because we're going to have a conversation later about a strategy that's really pushing Christian nationalism in public schools. And I think that some of that is actually showing up in some of these numbers, that people who have recently been in public schools likely are slightly more likely to be embracing Christian nationalism than maybe some of the people in the population who haven't been in public school quite as recently. The last set of bars are the racial breakdown. And a surprising result here, I think, is that among the respondents here, Black respondents were slightly more likely to embrace Christian nationalism than any other racial group, including white Americans. I think that is surprising to many people. I think one note, and again, this is where if you're interested in this, I'd really invite you to go deeper with PRRI polling. Just because someone embraces Christian nationalism, it doesn't always show up the same way in support for different policy measures. So for instance, Black Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are not as likely as white Americans who embrace Christian nationalism to hold views that are consistent with anti-Black racism. Okay, so just because you are embracing Christian nationalism does not necessarily mean it comes out in the same way with support for different policies, depending on racial or ethnic categorization. But I do think that these bars at the bottom are important to show that, and this is why often I actually use Christian nationalism as opposed to white Christian nationalism. I think the title of white Christian nationalism suggests that one has to be white to embrace it. And these results show that that's just not the case. That Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism is an ideology that is both embraced and rejected by people of all racial and ethnic categories in the United States. So the next slide kind of again breaks this down by religious affiliation. That top bar again is all Americans. You've got your 30% who are moving towards Christian nationalism. The next line down is white evangelical Protestants. That is 65%. That is a remarkable difference from all Americans. The only other group to have a majority of their respondents to respond that they embrace Christian nationalism or that they are sympathetic to it are Hispanic Protestants. So it just shows that there is something, I think, different being taught in many of these churches when it comes to Christian nationalism from many of the other religious groups. All the other religious groups, of course, have some measure of embracing Christian nationalism or moving towards it. But for none of those other groups is it a majority position. And I think if you look down, for instance, to white mainline non-evangelical Protestant, you'll see it's 30%. The breakdown's a little different. It's more people who are likely to be sympathetic to it than fully adhering to it. But it's right on the national average. And so the takeaway here for me is that it is true that Christian nationalism is the biggest problem in white evangelical Protestant churches, but it is not only a problem in white evangelical Protestant churches. It is present in all different kinds of religious expressions and Christian expressions, and therefore it's incumbent on, and I really am mostly speaking to Christians in the work that I'm doing, but it's really incumbent on all Christians, regardless of our particular denominational identity or expression of Christianity, to grapple with and work to dismantle Christian nationalism. And then this final graph, again from PRRI, shows a state breakdown. And again, keep that 30% in mind. That's going to be your national average. The states that are in some shade of blue are over 30%, and the states that are in some shade of green are under 30%. And you'll see that Florida is 33%. My home state of Texas is 37. Okay. When I saw those results, I will say, pleasantly surprised. I might have guessed that we would be much higher above the national average, because Texas and Florida are kind of neck and neck to kind of have the most extreme policies influenced by Christian nationalism. But we are not the states that have the largest percentage of people who live there who hold these views. And I think that this helps explain again that those who hold views that are consistent with Christian nationalism are holding a disproportionate amount of power in certain states. And they're using the power that they have, one, to change the rules to try to hold on to that power, but two, to use their power to enforce their ideas on everyone else. So I use this particularly in your local context as a word of encouragement. Numbers are on your side, right? That this is a distinct minority of people in Florida who actually hold these views. And so it's important for those of us who are moving away from Christian nationalism to form more allies and coalitions to actually voice our opposition to the policies that are happening in our places in ways that are really harming our communities. I want to talk a little bit about how Christian nationalism is showing up in recent years. The slide on the right, of course, was a photo from January 6, 2021. That was a time when you could not miss the symbols of Christian nationalism that were present. And in fact, a year after the insurrection, BJC published with our friends at the Freedom from Religion Foundation a report that really detailed all of the instances of Christian nationalism, not just on January 6th itself, but in all of the lead-up rallies that were orchestrated and planned to culminate in the insurrection on January 6th. We provided that report to members of Congress who were working on the Select Committee on January 6th at the time. When we provided it, that committee members requested additional testimony, which many of us provided and submitted. And then we were very disappointed when the January 6th report came out later that year and did not include Christian nationalism at all. This shows that even, and I applaud that committee for its work. But there were limits to what they did. And they were not willing to take on Christian nationalism by name in the report itself. And so days after that report came out, BJC, along with other groups, helped organize a sunrise vigil on January 6, 2023. That's the photo on the left. And we gathered faith leaders at dawn across from the Capitol to bear witness to the anniversary January 6th, but also to specifically name Christian nationalism as a contributing cause to the violence that was there on that day. We thought it was our duty that if Congress lacked the moral courage to call out Christian nationalism, that it was on us to do that. And that, I think, is an example of bringing our faith to bear in the public square, but as a way not to promote Christian nationalism, but actually to dismantle it, not to force our views on everyone else, but to use our faith-based perspective to bring light to this problem. Now, of course, the threat to democracy did not end on January 6, 2021, right? We saw this ideology and continue to see this ideology driving all kinds of attacks on pluralistic democracy and particularly on religious freedom. I want to name just a couple of those. Mike Johnson's name was already named today. He did work for the Alliance Defending Freedom before he went into political office. And then in his very first speech as House Speaker in 2023, he said this from the dais on the House floor, quote, "I believe that Scripture, the Bible, is very clear that God is the one who raises up those in authority. He raised up each of you, all of us." Now, by saying this, he was merging religious and political authority into one, textbook Christian nationalism. But he was also, I believe, making a very anti-democratic, small d democratic speech. God did not place those representatives in their seats. The people did. People who voted in free and fair elections sent representatives to Washington. And by suggesting that they were there because God ordained them to be there, that undercuts the foundations of U.S. representative democracy and the foundations of a free and fair vote and how we run that democracy. I also want to kind of distinguish here between a kind of faith-based advocacy and Christian nationalism. We can bring our faith-based perspectives into public policy and public advocacy without insisting that our given theological views be reflected in that law and policy. And so just some examples that we're seeing, particularly in state legislatures around the country in these last several months. In the wake of the Dobbs decision and the end of a constitutional right to an abortion, we've seen, of course, a number of abortion bans, and many of those bans are defining life as beginning at conception. And often they cite scripture alongside. This definition of life as beginning at conception is a theological perspective. It is not one that is shared by all religions, by all Christians. And by using that as the policy justification for abortion bans, it is a way of taking one given religious belief and trying to legislate it into law and policy. It's an example of passing a religious law in ways that really do violate foundational ideas of religious freedom in this country. We see similar arguments now being made and attacks on transgender people, non-binary people, and insisting that there are only two immutable genders, and often, again, citing scripture as their legal authority or their legal basis in order to pass these laws. We see it also in attempts to define secular marriage as only between a man and a woman. And many of these ideas are inherent in the Project 2025 playbook. And this idea, again, of trying to pass laws that are based on a given theological reading of Holy Scripture. We're also seeing we have an enormous problem right now in this country in the way that our immigration laws are and immigration enforcement is happening, and particularly when we see violence against immigrants and both by the government, but also outside of government and vigilante action as well. And often in some of this violence, underlying it is belief in something called replacement theory. Again, the great replacement theory is this belief that, quote, immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. And those researchers at PRRI asked their respondents about whether or not they agreed with the great replacement theory. And they found that those people who were adhering to or sympathetic to Christian nationalism were nearly twice as likely to hold a belief in the Great Replacement theory as those who were just skeptical of it. And even more likely than that from those who were rejecting it. So for those who were adhering to Christian nationalism, 68% of them also believed in the Great Replacement theory. Sympathetic, 62%. Skeptics, only 34%. And rejectors of Christian nationalism, only 9% of them it also believed in the Great Replacement theory. So we can really see a correlation between how much people are embracing Christian nationalism and how much they are also holding these views that are anti-immigrant and that are leading to quite a bit of violence. So those are just some of the examples of how Christian nationalism, I could go on much longer than that, but how it's posing a threat. Very quickly, I want to talk about, we see it quite a bit in our churches as well. I don't want to ever let churches off the hook. I think churches also need to be grappling with ways that our theologies, our worship practices, symbols that we have in our worship spaces, songs that we sing, liturgies that we read. I think all of these need to be looked at with a careful eye and to see, are there times that we are incorporating Christian nationalism in the way that we express Christianity in our worship spaces? And it's very incumbent. Of course, there's no government role in doing that because our churches are free from government control. It's really left to the responsibility of the congregations to do that work, and something that I really want to encourage those who are in Christian communities to have conversations in churches and to really delve into how Christian nationalism is impacting them. And, you know, I can't present without talking about what's happening in our public schools. Here are just some of the examples. I know you have seen almost all, if not all of these happening in Florida, but they're happening in other parts of the country too. This teaching of a Christian nation mythology in schools in place of a more honest history. So in Florida, at the same time, that AP African American history, for instance, was not allowed to be taught. At that same time, the governor was offering a large bonus for teachers who would go to a summer program that was put on by Hillsdale College that taught them how to teach government and civics from a Christian nationalist perspective. So this is a concerted effort that certainly has been happening in Florida, but also in other parts of the country as well. Often, a lot of these policies will be justified by saying, well, we're just trying to impose we're just trying to reflect our quote unquote Judeo-Christian values. I've come to see that term of Judeo-Christian as a red flag, or at the very least a yellow flag. And I want to say why. You know, there's no such thing as the Judeo-Christian religion, right? We have Judaism, we have Christianity. To use Judeo as a modifier of Christian is really, I think, offensive to Judaism as a distinct religion. And often when stories are taught, or there are prayers said or curriculum offered, any stories that happen to be there from the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, they're told through a Christian lens. They're not told from a Jewish perspective. They're told just as a precursor to Christianity. And often they are told with anti-Semitic undertones as well. So Judeo-Christian is really a very troubling term in and of itself, but also it often signals trying to give window dressing to inclusivity while still just promoting a particular Christian worldview. Not to mention the fact that it is exclusive of people from other religious faiths, as well as those who don't have a religion. And whereas the promise of religious freedom in this country is that everyone belongs, regardless of religious belief, or even if we have a religious belief or not. And so often that very justification is undercutting that promise. We've seen bills passed and proposed in legislatures all over the country to require the posting of "In God We Trust," or most recently, the Ten Commandments, in every public school classroom. That bill is tied up in court right now, or that law is tied up in court in Louisiana, because it directly contradicts a Supreme Court precedent on that very issue. So there's really a concerted effort by some of these groups and lawmakers to directly challenge constitutional precedent, in much the same way that they challenged Roe v. Wade. They're now going after these church-state precedents in a way to see if this court will overturn past work and actually further denigrate Establishment Clause protections in the United States. Efforts to teach the Bible, and not in a objective way, but in a devotional way through the public school curriculum, content bans and book bans. I know you all are all too familiar with those challenges, as well as efforts to pass laws that would require or encourage, rather, the hiring or accepting as volunteers school chaplains in public schools, often in place of mental health counselors. So all of this just shows the very concerted effort to do more in this area. Before we get to questions, I do want to just note there are several examples from the first days of the Trump presidency. Wednesday will be day 100, but we haven't even gotten to 100 days, and we've had so many instances of attacks and harm to religious freedom, including kind of the reaction to Bishop Marianne Budde's sermon on January 21st, attacks on religious social service providers who are delivering international relief and trying to call into question their religious integrity, or even falsely accusing them without any kind of support that they were engaging in criminal activity. Changing of immigration policy to allow immigration enforcement in "quote unquote" sensitive locations, including churches. So under this administration's policy, religious services can be interrupted by ICE officials trying to make arrests of people in religious services. And then an executive order that President Trump signed, and that is now being enforced in different agencies, that created a task force to root out anti-Christian bias. Just to be obvious, in a majority Christian country, we do not have rampant anti-Christian bias. Instead, this is kind of furthering this false narrative of persecution. And at the same time, I think it will be used to try to enforce a theological conformity, one that adheres to those who hold power, that fundamentalist view or reading of the Bible, and viewing any action or dissent or any difference from that as somehow being "quote unquote" anti-Christian bias, and then using the force of the government to enforce that. So very concerned, not just from a rhetorical perspective about the executive order itself, but actually how it might be used in the days to come. So what can we do to push back against all this? Well, you're doing it today. You're gathered there to try to learn more about this problem, form relationships with people in the room, and try to come up with some real solutions. I just want to offer a few. The Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, we have a number of resources. If for those of you who do have a Christian identity, you can actually sign a statement and become a Christian against Christian nationalism. But even if you're not a Christian or you don't want to sign the statement, there are so many other ways to plug into the work of our campaign, to access resources, to learn more about ways that you can bring this information, download everything on our website is free to download. You can pull anything down and share it with people in your community. As mentioned, coming out of this campaign, I wrote a book that was published last year by Broadleaf Books and is available now. I wrote it specifically to help answer the question, what can I do about Christian nationalism, and try to organize it by steps. And to really give some concrete ideas. But so much of it comes down, there's not just one answer, but if I had to say, what's the best thing that you can do? I really think it's getting more involved on the local level. You all are involved. I can tell you're there on a Saturday afternoon to hear this presentation. But what we're trying to do is really help organize and recognize local groups that are working on this issue. And these are just some of the places that we've had people reach out who want to have a deeper relationship with our campaign and learn more about local organizing and get more resources. So, would love to connect with anyone there about how you might more closely affiliate with the organization. This QR code will take you to the local group's website, a page on our website to learn much more about the work that we're doing on the local level. I have gone over my allotted time, but I'm going to stop sharing, and I'd love to take a few questions before you all get to the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm curious, do you think, or is there any theory, is the U.S. military a source for Christian nationalism being expanded? And I ask that simply because it seems like in a lot of millistic groups that we hear about, or when there are people, more violent individuals at some of these families that I would say Trump puts on, there seem to be a lot of military trained individuals that are, for instance, in the January 6th protests.
Yeah, so and I'm going to repeat questions to be sure I got most of it, but just kind of what's the connection between the U.S. military and Christian nationalism? I think my simple answer is U.S. military is huge, right? Lots of diversity within the military, and there is definitely differences, I would think, different branches, different administrations, different localities. And so I don't think that there's just like kind of one answer. But I there are examples certainly of people who are fully embracing Christian nationalism who have a military background. To see more of that, like I would say one example of that is Michael Flynn, right? Michael Flynn, who's disgraced general, spent a lot of time. There's actually an excellent Frontline documentary about Michael Flynn that I would really recommend. It kind of goes more in depth and kind of how his particular worldview was shaped, often by, even before he was in the military, but also by his military service. And I think some of that, particularly through the war on terror and how anti-Muslim, a lot of that rhetoric and a lot of the way that we even approached some of those wars was that some people really did embrace that kind of ethos there. But I would just kind of caution not to paint with too broad a brush, because there are also a lot of people both serving in the U.S. military now, but also veterans who are really opposed to Christian nationalism. And some of the work that I'm doing is actually partnering better with military and veterans groups about how we can work together to really help kind of show that that's not a monolith, but it is a problem. And we didn't go kind of totally in depth, but I think some of the threat that we're facing now, of course, is some of Trump's promises in some ways or attempts to turn the U.S. military into some kind of domestic law enforcement body, but also just some of the training and the violence. And then when people leave, if they've been trained in that way, does that kind of go into some kind of paramilitary place? And so there's real danger there. But I don't know that there's something like, I think that it's not a necessary component. I think that just people who are in the U.S. military, we have all types, and it's important to work with people who are committed to dismantling it.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Richard Stanley. I'm a Unitarian Universalist of Sarasota. And well, I tried to sign the petition, or rather, the statement that you referenced with Barcode. And I guess one concern I have is that even though I grew up Methodist, I no longer identify as a Christian. And to sign that statement, I have to check the box I identify as a Christian. I'm just worried about that because I'm torn between signing or not, and I'm checking that which presents a problem for me.
I appreciate that. And I think it helps open up like kind of this point. There's so many different ways to engage with our campaign. One is signing the statement, but it's not the only way to engage with the campaign. So I kind of leave it up to each person in their individual conscience about how they want to handle that particular entry point. When we started the campaign, we made a deliberate choice to call it Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And the first piece was that statement. And it was actually our friends who were not Christian, particularly our Jewish friends, our Muslim friends, who encouraged us to do this work because they said, you Christians are the ones who, for one, who this is really your problem mostly, and you've done the most to perpetuate it. And also that you can speak with an authenticity that we can't about some of the things I talked about today, about how it is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus, how it is a form of idolatry, that there was an important religious message to be imparted that we could only do. And so that's kind of why we made it that at the beginning. But I will say we work with so many people who aren't Christian, and some of our kind of strongest supporters are people from other faiths and people who are agnostic or atheist, people who are really exposed in this environment and attacked for not being fully American because they don't hold a given religious belief. And they're really gratified to see a group of Christians who are doing this work. So yeah, I leave it at that. I would love for you to be engaged in the campaign, anyone in that room, even if you don't sign the statement. That's just one way to engage.
The question has to do with the Johnson Amendment. There's an amendment that Johnson passed, limiting 501c organizations, all kinds of nonprofit organizations, to limit them in some way. And I believe it applies to religious organizations too. For example, churches coming out and endorsing a political candidate. Now, I know that in the last couple of elections, that's happened frequently. And I've not heard of any of those churches being brought to task for that or losing their nonprofit exemptions, or I know one of the voters of Christian Alaska is to get rid of that amendment, so they can endorse whoever they want to. Do you have any idea where the push is right now with the Johnson Amendment?
Yeah, so just generally on the Johnson Amendment, great question. It's something that our organization did a lot of advocacy around in the first Trump administration, because one of his very early priorities, he promised to totally destroy the Johnson Amendment. He did not do that in the first administration. Again, he could not do that. It would take an act of Congress. There was a bill that was trying to do away with it, which failed, in part, I think in large part because of advocacy from a broad and diverse nonprofit sector. That the nonprofit sector, actually, it is important to our integrity that we not endorse political candidates, and also that we not otherwise intervene in partisan campaigns for public office. And the vast majority of churches want that too, right? And I think we have this minority, it's kind of like Christian nationalism. We have this minority of churches who are out there openly violating the Johnson Amendment by by endorsing candidates, by basically turning their worship services into political rallies, by doing things with their membership lists, all of those things, and they get all the attention. But the vast majority of churches are both not doing that, nor do they want anything to do with it. And this administration, there is a bill that has been filed that would again try to do away with the Johnson Amendment. And given where Congress is now, I still think that it would get bogged down, at least in the Senate. But it's something that we're attending to and will oppose. But again, it would take an act of Congress. And we also know with this Trump administration, they've decimated they're trying to decimate the whole federal government, but including the IRS. And so the Johnson Amendment really has been under enforced for all these years. I can't imagine that it's going to be enforced much going forward. But if they actually repealed the law, what the Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation said last time, what we'd see is this huge influx of political campaign donations basically being funneled through nonprofit organizations for the tax exemption. And it would just fundamentally change the character of the nonprofit sector in ways that I think would be incredibly harmful for civic society. So I expect, BJC will certainly be part of what I think will be a large and diverse coalition who will be opposing this measure again this year.
I'd like to give an example of the executive order eradicating anti-Christian bias. And I worked at the VA, and I retired 2 years, and somebody kind of smuggled this out for me because they wanted me to see it. So the VA has, in alignment with the executive order, formed their own anti-Christian bias task force. And what they are doing is the task force now requests all VA employees to submit any instance of anti-Christian discrimination to the anti-Christian bias report at the ADACO. And the submissions should be sufficient identifiers, such as names, dates, and locations. And to take it a little further, they are specifically seeking any examples of adverse actions taken in response to an accommodation request, any retaliatory action taken in response to religious holiday observances, any adverse responses to requests for religious exemptions, the vaccine mandate, any requests for religious accommodations, any mistreatment or reprimand issued in response to displays of Christian imagery or symbols, any observances of mistreatment for not participating in events or activities inconsistent with Christian views, any retaliatory actions taken or threatened in response to abstaining from certain procedures or treatments, for example, abortions or hormone therapy.
Okay.
Get it.
Okay, we get it.
Got it. So it's not really a question.
Well,
It's definitely an example of this in action. And so I wanted to share it with everyone. There's a couple more things in it that I won't share so I don't take up too much time, but it's out there.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'll just respond very briefly. Of course, people should not be discriminated in the workplace on the basis of religion. And we have U.S. law that protects that, called Title VII, right? And that applies to any religion. So my one response is this is kind of unnecessary and over the top to kind of create a task force. It also is singling out Christianity for special treatment, right? Because we should also be, concerned with anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bias. We know by numbers that those two are much higher than any kind of anti-Christian bias in American society. And so it just isn't very sincere to single out anti-Christian bias in this way. But what I think could happen, right? Then you also have, of course, there are all kinds of already kind of employment law protections where if someone had instances where their religion wasn't being accommodated or wasn't being respected in the workplace, they would have legal avenues to pursue for their rights. And so this sets up kind of this reporting on each other's structure, and then how just frankly, I don't trust this task force to evenly apply the law. And I'm concerned that what will end up is that there will be government protection and enforcement for certain religious views, but not for other religious views. And I feel much more comfortable leaving this up to the American legal system and the laws that we already have in place to protect against bias. And I'm not saying that there are zero examples of religious discrimination, including against Christians. Of course that there are, but we have legal protections set up in other places by singling out Christianity, by setting up this task force, and by enforcing it in this way. I think it's really a concerning trend that we're seeing that really could lead more to what looks like theocracy and less like pluralistic democracy.
Hi, Amanda. My name is Joseph. I appreciate your presentation. I bought your book on audio and I'm enjoying the reading. Thank you for your analysis. One of the things that we need to remind ourselves to think about is what does the world look like when there is no religious diversity? When we collapse Christianity into a very narrow set of ideas? What is the outcome of that? And I think what happens is it leads to violence against people of other religious traditions. If you look at fascist movements that have happened in the past, look at the Nazis that went after Jewish community, that went after Jehovah's Witnesses, that went after one of the marginalized groups, because in their religious world they could not tolerate diversity, became an enemy, became a counter narrative to what they were trying to preach. And what we're seeing now, everything is because of the next step. You are being conditioned now to prepare you for the next step. So religious intolerance prepares you for political intolerance, prepares you for intolerance of anyone that doesn't look white and Christian. So this is a preparation movement in pursuit of the consolidation of the world. And I did a recent trip to Europe, and on many of the tours, biking tour, and when not a biking tour, really good tour, very expensive, but a really good tour. We go into castles, we go into churches. They say another church, and you see these beautiful churches, and just absolutely stunning. The Lutherans here, the Catholics were here, the Lutherans were here, the other religious sects were here, but they didn't get along. No, they didn't get along. There was a lot of religious war, a lot of strife. So what I'm saying is, be careful. We are being prepared for the next step. It's so important to know your history, and I appreciate you and all the work that you've done. Thank you. Any other question? We'll be glad. Thank you.
Good afternoon, man. My name is Jules Ray. I live in Colony, Florida. And I wanted to point out both to you and to everyone in the room that we have spent a lot of time in Tallahassee this legislative session. I've been up there for many weeks. I've heard a lot of testimony. And one of the people that consistently comes up is John Labriola from the Christian Family Coalition. And every year he gets up and spews extremism. saying that LGBTQ people are pedophiles, perverts, this and that, and stealing his version of Christian nationalism. And one of the things we've seen is that it's really bad at it. These people aren't, they try to get anti, for example, and they're both years that failed. And I wanted to ask you, Amanda.
We're going to take a break now.
So this few 10% or so.
Okay.
That
I hit.
are the
This recording.
Christian nationalism. How effective are they? Because in Florida, they're kind of bad at it. So in Texas and in other states, like, how big is the pushback against this, and how effective are these Christian nationalists at actually getting real policies passed, rather than just talking a lot of really loud nonsense?
Just very quickly, well, I heard most of it, but the question is how. I need the microphone. I can't hear it without the microphone.
How effective are they at passing policy?
How effective are they?
Yeah.
Well, because of political gerrymandering, they're very effective, right? Because I can speak more directly to the experience in Texas, which is where I live. I imagine you're sensing something similar in Florida, where elections are decided not in November, but when the primaries are held. Because the way that the lines are drawn, there are very few competitive seats. And so in the primaries, at least in Texas, the more extreme candidates are winning, both because of the voters who come out in primaries, but also because of the money that's being poured into primaries. In Texas, for instance, last legislative session, the governor was not able to pass his school voucher plan because a number of Republicans voted against it. And so then moneyed interests, most of them also fueled by Christian nationalism, primaried all those people and got them out of office. And guess what? Vouchers passed in Texas this week because of that. So that's what we're also seeing with these really extreme policies. So I think they're effective because they've rigged the votes, as far as the way they've drawn their districts in ways that create safe seats. But it's not democratic, small d democratic, in that it's not actually representing the will of the people. And in states like Florida, where you have ballot initiatives, you can see that. Right. In states like Texas, we don't have ballot initiatives, so we don't have a form of direct democracy to overrule what's happening. But we're unfortunately seeing a new kind of boldness by those who are pushing Christian nationalism. To the previous speaker's point, they've been conditioned along the way so that these policies that once had been seen as completely outside the possibility, they're now being much more forthright in how they're trying to actually pass Christian laws. They're trying to, and by Christian laws, I mean, use their interpretation of scripture into law and policy. And so there's a real boldness there. An effective response to that, I think, is for that majority of people in Florida, majority of people in the United States, to be more active in our public advocacy, that we want religious pluralism in this country. We stand up for religious freedom against this kind of religious theocracy. And I think that kind of public advocacy in lots of ways can make a difference. But I'm also clear-eyed about how long of a strategy has gone into kind of changing the personnel at the state and local level, but also, as we're all seeing, at the federal level as well.
Ms. Tyler, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.